This is one of those games that keeps changing what you think it is. Anomaly President looks like a straightforward pixel art action roguelite with a political gimmick, but a few hours later I was expanding a campaign bus, collecting magical creatures, trying to improve poll numbers, and planning my next run around upgrades I had unlocked outside of combat. The game ties all of those systems together in a way that feels surprisingly cohesive, and the campaign structure, while confusing at first, becomes much easier to understand after a few runs. This is the new game from the developers of Anomaly Agent, and it is currently in early access. The question is whether the version available right now already feels worth investing time into. In Anomaly President, you play as Venti, the son of a presidential candidate. Your goal is to help your father gain popularity and win support across the city, while an opposing faction uses anomaly-related technology and brainwashing to manipulate the public for its own goals. The world is also filled with magical creatures called Fluffies. The enemies hunt and exploit them to gain power, while your side shelters them and uses them to strengthen both the campaign bus and your combat runs. Anomalies are supernatural powers tied to the Fluffies and the strange phenomena spreading through the city. At its core, this is an action roguelite side-scroller, but the game's structure is best described as a persistent campaign with roguelite runs embedded inside it. The stages and bosses follow the story, so they appear in a fixed sequence. When you begin a run, you first choose 2 weapons on the bus and then enter an overworld map where you select the next stage or stop at optional activities that can give extra resources. Each stage is divided into a series of combat arenas. You clear the enemies, move to the next area, and at the end of most rooms, a Fluffy lets you choose the category of your next reward. The specific reward is still randomized, but this gives you some control over the direction of your build. During a run, you can find new weapons, support Fluffies, passive buffs, elemental effects, and anomaly powers that stay with you until the run ends. Your character also levels up, which adds another layer of randomized upgrades as the build develops. The campaign bus is easily the most important system in the game. You start with a small bus and gradually expand it with new rooms. Some rooms increase your campaign popularity, some improve combat, some unlock new activities on the overworld map, and others strengthen the support Fluffies that help you during runs. Reaching higher popularity levels unlocks new room types and additional progression systems, so political progress and gameplay progress are directly connected. You can also permanently improve the starting level of your weapons, the starting level of support Fluffies, your maximum health, and your anomaly powers. As the bus expands, you also begin unlocking entirely new weapons and abilities. The bus eventually becomes the center of almost all long-term progression, which is also why the opening hours can feel a little overwhelming. The game does not do a great job explaining what each room actually affects, and I spent my first couple of hours making upgrades without really understanding which ones were going to matter. That becomes even more noticeable because the early runs are surprisingly harsh. You start with low health, low damage, and no reliable way to heal. Healing is tied to bus progression, so recovery options only begin appearing after you unlock the right bus upgrades. Once that happens, healing builds become extremely strong, especially when you start finding effects that restore health on kill. Combat is the part that will probably sell most people on the game. The game is designed around chaining attacks from both weapons into a single combo flow, so you can switch between health damage and posture damage depending on what the fight demands. Every enemy has both a health bar and a posture bar. If you break posture, normal enemies can be finished instantly, while bosses take heavy damage. Some weapons are better at health damage, while others specialize in posture damage, so it's much more effective to bring one weapon for each role. The stages also support this system well. Environmental objects are placed in ways that encourage you to use them during fights, and they deal meaningful posture damage. Parrying is another mechanic that deserves mention. The parry window is fairly generous, and a successful parry deals posture damage. Against aggressive enemies and bosses, I found myself relying on parries much more than dodges. Then there are the anomaly powers that consume anomaly energy. These are your special abilities, and they can range from firing a shotgun blast to summoning a massive sword strike that cuts through groups of enemies. They can be activated in the middle of combos and grant invincibility frames during the animation. Anomaly energy is refilled through your normal attacks. As runs progress, the game becomes increasingly chaotic in a good way. You can acquire elemental weapons, stack passive buffs, summon support Fluffies that attack when you perform certain actions, and combine all of that with anomaly powers. By the later stages, combat turns into a controlled mess of overlapping abilities and support attacks. One concern I had was that the fixed stages would become repetitive after a few attempts. The story helps with that more than I expected. Each stage includes multiple story events that continue progressing every time you reach them. Even after several hours, I was still encountering new dialogue and scenes I had not seen before. Visually, this game is gorgeous. The pixel art is detailed, but the animation work is what really stands out. The movement, attacks, enemy reactions, and anomaly effects make the combat feel extremely fluid, and the music fits both the quieter campaign moments and the faster fights. The weakest part of the game for me was the mini-games. They provide useful resources for boss upgrades, but they are not particularly fun or polished and mostly feel like short breaks between combat sections. Since the game is in early access, the campaign has not reached its final confrontation yet, and some of the boss and side systems still feel rough around the edges. But with that said, I think Anomaly President is already a strong early access game if the idea of a persistent campaign mixed with action roguelite runs sounds appealing to you. The combat has real depth, the boss progression gives failed runs a clear sense of long-term growth, and the story supports replayability more than I expected. I'd be more hesitant if you mainly want a fully finished story campaign or highly polished side activities, because those are the areas where the early access status is most noticeable. But even in its current state, the loop of upgrading the boss, getting stronger between runs, and experimenting with different combat builds is already genuinely fun. If you'd like to check the game out, the link is in the description. If you've played Anomaly President, let us know what you think. And if you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and sticking around for more. I'll see you in the next one.